In this video we want to introduce the idea of organizational culture and to look at some ideas related to this and just generally discuss it in an introductory way to set the foundation so that subsequent videos can build upon this and give a more elaborate picture. So to start, one writer, Martin, in 2005 defines organizational culture as follows. He said, culture seeks to describe those facets of human experience and behavior that contribute to the difference and similarities in how people engage with their perceived world. So what this definition is doing is it's linking the way in which our experiences and our behavior, it links these across communities and across individuals so that we share certain experiences, and out of that shared experience and shared backgrounds we developed common behavior which fits in, it accommodates each other. So we live in communities. And this is how we perceive the world. We perceive the world through this perspective that's been given to us from our experiences, from our education, from our history, from our music, from our art. And we start to see the world in this context. And that, in a sense, determines our culture. Jacques, in 1952, suggests customarily and traditional way of thinking and doing things, and which is shared to a greater or lesser degree by all members, and which the new members must learn and at least partially accept in order to be accepted into services of the firm. So this one is suggesting that companies can have their own, if you like, subcultures. The culture relates to the wider culture, the societal culture, but it's a subculture because companies have traditions and backgrounds and experiences, and they have learned to do things in a certain way, and they may even have their own language and relate to certain processes with certain language that is unique to them. It's something that's developed within the company. They have processes, they have documentation and procedures, which all of which goes to determine the way in which the workers relate to each other. So there is, in a sense, a subculture within companies. And of course, new members to the company must learn this subculture if they are going to survive within the company. They must learn the way in which the people within the company relate to each other and relate to the company and relate to the management. They must learn this and they must observe it, and then they must adopt that subculture, that company culture, if they are going to survive within it. Killman, in 1985, suggests culture reflects the ideologies, shared philosophies, values, beliefs, assumptions, attitudes, expectations, and norms of an organization. So the culture must look at the way in which the management see the company, the direction in which the company is moving, the emphasis the management place on such things as growth, or research and development, or image, and what they want to see from their employees in terms of quality, dedication, application, diligence. They want to have a certain attitude which is perhaps reflects efficiency and a matter-of-fact approach to work which means the work can be done efficiently to a high quality with minimal supervision because the workers are engaged. Clearly it overlaps with issues like motivation and leadership, but the organizations have a culture, and the beliefs of that organization in terms of the direction of where it wants to be and what it believes the future will hold for it, the attitudes of the management towards the workers and the workers towards the management, the expectations that all the different groups within the company hold of each other, all of these go to make up the culture of the organization. It's a very complex picture, but nonetheless it's real and it exists. Companies do differ. Companies have different stances regarding the way they deal with their employees, the way they deal with their customers, the way they deal with their suppliers. They have internal processes which they use, which may be at variance to what other companies use, but they reflect that particular product, that particular industry. They have their own ways of doing things, and that's their individual culture. Organizational culture refers to the underlying values, beliefs, and code of practice that's involved in shaping up an environment, society, the self-image of members. So culture comes from the outside to some extent. The workers bring in to the business. They come in, they arrive in the business with certain sets of values. So clearly those are going to be pervasive within the organization. But the organization itself will have its own ways of working and its own values. And those will impact on the employees. So the characteristics of businesses will be slightly different to those of societies, the society in which they operate. The workers will have different views. And we can see this in, say, a country like the UK, where in the past there was a coal mining, a large and quite prosperous coal mining sector. And the coal miners lived in communities. They had their own culture, their own values. They lived within the wider society, but they also had their own traditions, as had shipbuilders, as had the fishermen who live by the coast. They have their own traditions, their own ways of looking at their industry. So organizational culture, it fits within the larger culture, but it's also slightly varied in some respects. And that's actually a good thing. It makes the world a more interesting place. Organizational culture has a range of elements such as symbolism and leadership in order to enhance employee commitment. And there is symbolism. There's symbolism in the way in which they go about their activities, the routines they have developed. There's a symbolism about the way in which the different employees work and what they do. And there is a thread of leadership running through the organization, with the more senior managers given more macro leadership, all the way down to the line manager who gives, if you like, micro leadership, who interfaces with the workers directly and motivates the workers and ensures that the values of the organization are communicated all the way through the organization. Edgar Schein developed a model which outlines the foundation of culture. His model is useful in understanding corporate and national cultures, and it's worth going across this particular model just to see how it works and what light it can shed on this issue of culture, which is a very vague and very complicated subject. So Edgar Schein's model is as follows. The main attributes of his model states that culture can be explained and understood by analysing the core values and assumptions of any culture. So, to understand the culture, we need to understand the assumptions of the culture. In other words, we need to really try to figure out what the culture is about and why is it the way it is. What are its assumptions? We'll talk about this in a second. So we have the underlying assumptions of the culture, and let's call it level 3. Well, level 2 in that case would be common values, beliefs, attitudes and norms. Now, these come out of the assumptions. Now, the assumptions are that, let's say, in a particular society, that people should live with dignity and respect, and they should not be subjected to discrimination or attacks, or they should live peacefully. Those sort of underlying assumptions, the ones we can hopefully relate to. Now, out of this, we would get the common values. Common values is that people should be respected, and people should be free to practice their beliefs and not force their beliefs on someone else. Their attitudes should be perhaps respected, and the norms of the society, the way the society works, should be respected as well. And finally, at level 1, we have the perceived culture. The perceived culture is what we can see. This is what we identify. We identify the way in which people relate to each other, the way they dress, the way they act, their art, their music, the way they live, their food, their education, their beliefs. So, to really understand the culture, we need to understand the assumptions upon which it's based. Why is the culture the way it is? And once we understand that, we can then understand the common values and the beliefs and the attitudes and the norms. And out of that is what we can see. This is the culture of the society. Let's talk about it in a little more detail. We'll start with the perceived culture, the one at the top. Now, this refers to the visible aspect in a culture and is the most obvious level. It's what we can see. It's the way people dress, act, behave, the way they spend their time, what they believe to be right and wrong, and their values. Mostly recognized by people who are not part of the culture. As they belong to a different culture, it's evident to them that the culture is different. So we see it mostly when we travel. We go to a different country, let's say, we can see differences between that country and our home country. The way we live normally at home is within, if you like, our culture. Then we go to a different country, we can see a difference. We can see people in this other country live differently. They have different traditions, different ways in which they relate to each other. They have different food, different music, different dress, different belief systems, different laws. But we can only see that because we have left our home environment and gone to see that country. Of course, we could pick it up by reading it and saving the journey. Instead of going there, we could read about what travellers have said about the culture, and we can do a comparison between the two that way. Outsiders may find it difficult to understand another culture. Sometimes we don't quite understand why it is people live in a certain way. We find it difficult because it's not what we experience, and therefore we find it difficult to understand how they can live the way they do. It's just a difference in culture. it doesn't mean one is superior to the other. It's just simply a different way of living, and the differences need to be understood and respected. But at the same time, it's difficult sometimes for one set of people to understand a different set of people because their traditions are so radically different. These are the factors that describe the group in action, such as dress codes, furniture, working climate, routine, stories, ceremonies, organizational structures. So we see differences between societies based on many factors. And in terms of organizations, which is really what we're talking about, all of these different factors are brought into the organization. So we would expect organizations in other countries to be different to essentially similar organizations in this country. We expect if they're making the same product, they will have essentially the same technologies because the internet has more or less removed differences. We know what is efficient practice. But the work routines, the way the workers relate to each other, the length of the working week, the conditions under which they work, these may vary because these may more fully reflect their culture. The technologies may be common between countries, but the cultures may be different. And these will impact within organizations. Now, common values. Well, this level looks into the factors that determine the perceived culture. These common values are developed by leaders on the basis of shared assumptions. So common values is what links people together. They relate to each other because they share common values. If they don't share the common values, that society will come apart. But likewise, within organizations, there must be agreement between management and the workforce. There must be agreement between different layers of the management. They must have common values. They must be pulling in the same direction. Otherwise, the organization will fail. So there is a need for common values. For example, how the company should undertake its daily routines, how employees should be managed and motivated. There should be a common approach. There should be an understanding on the part of the various managers of what is required. And the managers should communicate this amongst themselves and also to the employees. These are common values. If, as I said earlier, they don't share these common values, then that company will come asunder. It'll fragment, it'll break, because there will be dissent and disagreement. It's vital that common values developed by leaders are supported by general assumptions of the culture. So it's not only that there is an internal agreement on common values from top management all the way down through the workforce, and they're all pulling in the same direction. They all understand what's required, and there is respect and understanding. But that respect and understanding is also part and parcel of the wider culture. So there should not be a conflict between the organization's culture and the wider culture. The values of the wider culture should be reflected inside the organization. Albeit there will be a variance, a slight variance, because there is the need to produce products and to ensure efficiency and ensure commercial viability. But the values inside the organization cannot be at wide variance with those of the values of the society. The underlying assumptions, well, these relate to the shared values within a culture. Individuals have their own underlying assumptions of the world and how it operates. And we all have our own little shopping lists almost of what we would like to see, what sort of world we would like to live in, and what we would like to happen. But the more of us who agree about these underlying assumptions, the more of us that work together towards achieving this, then the more chance there is of that type of society coming about. Now, although this can explain the wider culture, it could also explain dissent within society. The underlying assumptions of the society must be agreed by the vast majority of the people. If they are not agreed, then there is a recipe for political upheaval and turmoil within that society. So having shared values means that there is an understanding that the society is founded on certain assumptions, certain ways of living, and the people within the society have accepted those underlying assumptions. If that is the case, the society is well structured and will persist. If there is disagreement, radical disagreement about the underlying assumptions, then the society itself may tear itself apart because of political problems and political disagreements. It's much the same within the organisation. There must be general agreement on the direction in which the organisation is moving. Is the organisation dedicated to, for example, bringing about rapid economic growth? Or is the organisation dedicated towards having a quiet life and just working within their limitations and their capability and not being unduly stressed? What is the underlying assumption of the business? Because once that is articulated, then the common values of the business are articulated, which determines the culture of the business. The assumptions are not visible to the individual, nor are they directly related to the individual's behavior and attitude. We, generally speaking, don't experience the assumptions. We have to look for what it is that underpins the existence of organizations, and indeed underpins the existence of a particular society. And those are the underlying assumptions. Of course, we may disagree about the interpretation of the assumptions as well. I may determine that the organization's underlying assumptions are a certain type, and you may disagree. You may think they're different. In fact, the founders of the organization themselves may not have properly articulated or understood the assumptions that they were working towards. And sometimes we delegate the need for articulating the underlying assumptions to wider philosophical stances. We think of the economics of the business. The business must survive, therefore revenue must exceed costs. And that's sufficient for us to understand. But to understand the culture of the organization, we must understand the common values, what links the people together, and how the organization functions on a day-to-day basis. And to understand the common values, we must understand the underlying assumptions that are accepted for those common values to be accepted. These assumptions can articulate human nature or human relations. So the assumptions are very fundamental, and it's very difficult to get a precise picture of those assumptions because they are so vague and also so variable. But they do articulate human nature. or human relations. How do we relate to each other? And what is our human nature? How do we see working with our fellow man? How do we relate to the power complex within an organization, running from the chief executive officer all the way to the person who cleans up on the shop floor? And how do we respect the dignity and the existence of the various personalities within the organization? And this must be understood. This may be part of the wider society and the respect that we have to show to each other, and we want to show to each other in the wider society. And that is simply carried into the organization. But it's certainly important that we understand the underlying assumptions. Now, the effectiveness of the model. Well, Schein's model enables managers, leaders, and so on to evaluate a culture. They will be able to understand and analyze the relationship between assumptions and business practices within an organization. So it's important that there is consistency right throughout, that the underlying assumptions, which reflect the common values, which can then be implemented in terms of policies, and the policies of the organization in relationship to its workforce or to its customers, those policies should not be at variance with the common values or the underlying values of the society. If the society expects people to be honest and decent, the organization should not attempt to cheat. It shouldn't engage in practices which are not acceptable within the wider society. Once management leaders have an understanding of this model, they can experiment by changing the assumptions in order to help to improve efficiency. Well, it may be the case that by consultation and by discussion, they're able to talk about the way in which we live in the wider society, and then make some distinction between that and our working lives, and say that within our non-working lives we're free to live in a certain way, but within the organization we must relate to each other, and we must relate to each other in a way which generates efficiency and productivity and output. And it's possible perhaps for the managers to vary those assumptions, perhaps just very gradually, but over a period of time perhaps the changes might be quite radical, which may make it difficult for new members of the company coming in, because they're going to find the working practices of the organization vastly different to what they expect because of their experiences of the wider society. But it may be the case that the managers are able to vary the assumptions and thereby generate a different set of working practices, different common values to those of the wider society. Not at variance with the wider society, just an understanding that within the workplace they need to perhaps be more diligent, more careful, more productive, and perhaps not as easygoing perhaps as the wider society, if that's the way the wider society is structured. The need to improve efficiency could be the result of competition, regulation, policy, making it necessary to make changes to assumptions for survival and growth. We don't live in static worlds. We live in worlds which are evolving. They're evolving because of all sorts of issues, not just technological, but greater contact between different societies. And we understand what's happening in other countries and other areas. And this leads to changes within our own society. We have movements of people, and we have different cultural influences. And sometimes organizations in order to improve efficiency, simply have to explain what they want to see. And that becomes a requirement to work within that organization. So the people who work there still have their culture, the wider culture. The organization respects it, so it's incorporated into the values of the organization, but the management also require the workers to be efficient, to apply themselves, and to be innovative and respect the working practices of the organization, because these working practices are necessary if the organization is going to survive. Now, the dimensions of culture. Well, Schein recognized 6 sets of dimensions. These factors determine the culture within an organization. So there are 6 sets of dimensions of culture within an organization. First of all, regular patterns of behavior observed within an organization. Now, this could be done through induction ceremonies, in group languages, and ritualized behavior. We observe behavior patterns within organizations. We observe the way the people work. We observe the way they go about their work. And this is a part of the routine of their lives. So regular patterns of behavior observed within an organization. This is how the workforce behave. And it can't easily be changed. So the management have to find ways of engaging the workforce to be efficient and apply themselves and so on, but at the same time recognizing that this is the way the workforce live, this is their culture, and this is what they bring to the company. Embedded values and beliefs expressed through groups and organizations. This may be through quality image. The workers do have embedded values. They have certain ways of thinking. Whether the management agree with the ways in which the workers think or not is broadly irrelevant, because that is the way the workers think. These are the values that are being inculcated through the education system and through the wider society as the individuals grew and developed. And this means that the individuals within the workplace will want to perhaps have contact with other members within the workplace, form groups and organizations, and they will want to relate to each other in certain ways. And the organization, there's very little the organization can do about that. That is a part of the culture. So in societies where culture is not so traditional and so pervasive, those ones are more easily they can more easily accommodate the requirements of business. In societies where culture is very strong and traditions are very strong, it may be difficult for businesses to flex, to bend, to accommodate those requirements. The expected norms of an organization. This includes the expected behavior of individuals. For example, excellent customer service practice. Well, the organization has got expectations. They expect the workforce to be efficient, to be diligent, to be careful, to be polite, to get on with their work, to show initiative. They expect this of the workforce, but they also expect them to portray the business in a good light and to try to give the best value to the customer as is possible, so that the business can flourish over a long period of time. So there are expected norms that the organization set. This is what the organization expects. The rules are instructions given by management of what must be taken into consideration. These rules have to be followed by employees in order to avoid punishment. So the organisation must have a set of rules. The rules must reflect the wider culture of the society, but it must also reflect fairness to individual workers within the organisation. So, for example, feuds within the society should not be taken into the workplace. The rule within the workplace is that the workers are there to be efficient, to make the products and complete tasks that are required of them, not to exercise some tradition which may be injurious to some members of the workforce. So the rules of the organisation should be followed, but the rules themselves should try to accommodate the wider culture, and that's a very difficult balancing act to achieve. But there is, in a sense, two cultures in play here. There is the wider culture of the society, and there is the commercial culture. There are commercial requirements of efficiency and productivity. And it's accommodating that difference. And that is the role of management in trying to achieve compromise and a working condition that somehow connects both of those cultures to enable the organisation to work and to be efficient. Philosophy can be defined as the underlying beliefs that individuals have about people. Philosophy tends to relate to the values of the managers who run the organisation. So it's important that the managers relate to the individuals within the organisation and understands the individuals within the organisation. The philosophy tends, as I said here, to relate to the values of the managers who run the organisation. So it's a linkage between the individuals and the beliefs about the individuals and the performance of the business. If the management believe that the workers are lazy, for example, or refuse training, or have excessive demands in terms of working hours or time in which the work starts or finishes, or if they see that as inhibiting the efficiency of the organisation, then there is conflict between the two. And clearly something must give there. Is it the case that the workers must leave the wider culture at the door when they come to the company? Or can the company accommodate certain parts of the culture but at the same time expect efficiency on the part of the workers? So that is a debatable point, but it's one that's very important for the success or failure of the business. Clearly, if there is a mismatch between the requirements of the workers and their cultural requirements and the efficiency of the organisation, then something must give. And more than likely, it's the company that will suffer, and the company will go out of business. But that means, of course, jobs have been lost, and the welfare of the wider society has been diminished as a consequence. The climate within the organisation. This is made up of factors such as the layout of the buildings, management styles, recreation facilities. The climate of the organisation helps to determine the culture of the organisation. The way the buildings are set out, the design of the buildings, the management styles, the way the management relate to the workers, and even recreation facilities, canteen facilities, and so on. So there are cultural relationships between physical assets like the buildings and human relationships, the relationship between the workers and the management, that go to determine the overall, I should say, culture of the organization. So it's complicated. The whole issue of culture and the role of culture within business is not easy to sort out. On the one hand, if there is a strong societal culture with certain belief systems, and these are at variance with the requirements for efficiency and productivity, then it's difficult to see how organizations can work within that climate. If the wider society can accommodate differences, then organizations may survive, but they may have to reflect the cultural traditions of the wider society within the workplace and respect the cultural traditions within the workplace, but at the same time expect efficiency. But how they can accommodate this is difficult and will vary from organization to organization or from one culture to the next. There is no set way of achieving this. But it needs to be done if business is to flourish in societies in general. Not just in one society, but in all societies. And it's important that business should flourish in different societies, because ultimately it's business that generates jobs and incomes and welfare. So the climate of the culture should be such that organizations can survive. Because if they can't, that culture itself will ultimately suffer. Complicated subject, as I said at the start, one that's well worth reading up, making your own notes, padding out some of the ideas in this video. But this video is not one of the easiest ones you'll encounter, as you can imagine. And now you've been to the end, you know what I mean. It is a difficult topic. It's one that needs a lot of thought and a lot of concentration. So please make some additional notes, do some additional reading, pad out your notes, and make sure you have a clear understanding of that interface between culture and efficiency, culture and organizational survival, and also be able to recognize the differences between wider cultural influences within society and the cultural influences within organizations. But that's all we're going to deal with here, so let's leave it at that now and say thank you for watching.